Still getting around to that fix on your car? You got this. On eBay, you'll find millions of parts guaranteed to fit. Doesn't matter if it's a major engine repair or your first time swapping your windshield wipers. eBay has that part you need, ready to click perfectly into place for changes big and small. Loud or quiet, find all the parts you need at prices you'll love. Guaranteed to fit every time. But you already know that. eBay. Things, people, love. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply.
Today on CityCast Boise, the recent Supreme Court decision on trans rights has left many LGBTQ Idahoans wondering what the future holds by exposing big questions about who gets to make deeply personal healthcare decisions. We're breaking down what the decision means and the impact it will have on our state. It's Wednesday, June 25th. I'm Lindsay Van Allen, and this is what Boise's talking about. Joining me to break down this decision is Jenna Damron, advocacy fellow and LGBTQ organizer with the ACLU of Idaho. I appreciate you being here today, Jenna.
Yeah, thanks, Lindsay. Happy to be here too.
Jenna, what's the Skrmetti decision, and why is it such a big deal for transgender rights across the country?
Yeah, so the Skrmetti decision is a United States Supreme Court decision and a United States Supreme Court case. It actually comes from Tennessee. And essentially last December, the Supreme Court heard oral arguments around Tennessee's ban on gender-affirming care for youth, which is really similar to Idaho's ban on gender-affirming care for youth, which was passed in 2023. So oral arguments were heard in December, and the court was essentially deciding, is it constitutional for the state of Tennessee and other states like Idaho to ban this care for transgender youth? And so we got the decision last week, and it wasn't a great decision. Right now, I think a lot of trans people across the U.S. and in Idaho are feeling the weight of that decision. And it really is kind of a landmark decision. It's one of the first times that the Supreme Court has taken up a really specific law for trans rights and for trans people. Beyond that, I think it is the first time that the Supreme Court has taken up healthcare for trans people.
And can you help me understand the reasoning behind this ruling a little more? Why did the Supreme Court say that it wasn't discrimination under the Constitution to deny trans kids gender-affirming healthcare?
Yeah. So when we look at, Supreme Court cases and really any court cases going through our legal system to prove discrimination, there are different standards that the court kind of measures that against. And so in this decision, the court decided that Tennessee's law that bans gender-affirming care for youth only has to meet something called rational basis review. And that is the lowest form of review that a court case needs to kind of go through in order to decide if it's discriminatory or not. The thing about rational basis review is that it defers to the government. And so one of the things that the plaintiffs and the ACLU was arguing in this case is that laws like this need to be under heightened scrutiny. And so with heightened scrutiny, there's a longer process. There's more that the case needs. There's more to say that it discriminates. And so the court decided that Tennessee's law only had to be scrutinized under this rational basis review and not under heightened scrutiny. And they decided that because they essentially said that this law does not discriminate on the basis of sex, but actually on the basis of a diagnosis or a gender dysphoria diagnosis. So what the court is saying is that this law doesn't discriminate on the basis of sex. It doesn't discriminate against trans status. Instead, it only applies to certain diagnosis, and it therefore doesn't violate the Equal Protection Clause.
And so just to make sure I understand, there are certain medications that are used for transgender people and transgender teens when they want to either stop puberty or change the hormones, change what hormones they're supplementing in their body. And so those are not just used for transgender people or for gender affirming care. Those are also, I saw this, I worked on a pediatric floor, and other not transgender, so cis children and teens received those same medications. And there was no outcry about that. There was no controversy about that. So cis children who identify with the gender they were assigned with at birth, can still receive those medications in Tennessee and in Idaho for different medical reasons, but transgender kids cannot, correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think that's one of the really interesting things about this ruling. We've seen, these laws have come up in, I think, 25 states across the US. And the court rulings on them have been, a little bit mixed. But any court that has applied a heightened scrutiny because of what you just said, saying, that other children can receive these medications, but trans children cannot, has found that these bans survive that heightened scrutiny standard, and they would likely be determined unconstitutional if that standard was being used. But the Supreme Court decided to use the rational basis review, which, like I said earlier, kind of defers more to the government than a heightened scrutiny, standard to prove discrimination.
What's the ACLU of Idaho's response to this decision?
Yeah, this is a really tough decision for Idaho. For most trans youth in Idaho, gender affirming care has been inaccessible for over a year at this point. So our response to this has really been one to support our community, to support the trans community here in Idaho, knowing that this Supreme Court decision doesn't change much in Idaho because the state of gender affirming care for youth has been inaccessible since that Supreme Court narrowed the injunction to apply just to the two plaintiffs. That being said, we know that this decision is felt all across Idaho by trans youth, by trans adults. We know that the Supreme Court ruling on this takes away that hope that that gender affirming care would be accessible here again for young people. And we also know that the community here feels a lot of fear when the Supreme Court takes up an issue like this, and then issues an unfavorable ruling. Our trans community really gets scared that this is going to apply to, other laws in Idaho, other court cases, other instances of discrimination, for example. And so on Saturday, this past Saturday, the Saturday following the ruling, we had an event down at Anne Frank. And we got our trans community together, provided some information about the case, but really our most important thing is we wanted a place for people to be together, to kind of process this, to be together. We know that our trans community here in Idaho is very, very resilient. Some of the strongest people I know, and they've just been under attack constantly for 5 years. And so we wanted to provide a space where they could be together. We did a community voices panel with all trans individuals talking about the case, talking about, what makes them feel most in their power, what they would want to say to the youth. And we had a great turnout for that event. It was really beautiful. I think the community really needed to come together and be together in that moment. And I think just being a part of that larger picture, folks across the U.S. on that very same day are mobilizing in support of trans people, really gave some hope back to the community and allowed us to, I'm sure you know this, but misinformation spreads like wildfire here in Idaho. And it's one of the biggest things that we fight against, because when you have misinformation, you also have fear, I think. And to be able to provide accurate information, to explain this decision, to explain the narrow implications of it, I think gave some power back to the community and gave some hope back to them to take some of that fear down.
I want to maybe dig in a little bit and get your perspective, because it seems like rarely do Supreme Court decisions happen in a vacuum or only have, one very narrow outcome. Could this decision potentially open the door for bans on other types of healthcare for LGBTQ people, or on the rights or for the rights of LGBTQ people?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. It's one that trans community, that queer community is really asking right now. I will say that I think the Supreme Court decision was a little bit unique in that it does apply pretty narrowly. And in the majority opinion, the conservative judges made that clear. So they made it clear that that they weren't really even touching if this law violates the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause, right? They brought up the Bostock decision in the opinion, and they said that this doesn't affect that. And that was a case on where it was shown that that the law, or not the law, but it was shown that a workplace discriminated against a trans person, and that was discrimination on the basis of sex, right? And so this case, I think that there is a lot of fear that this is setting a legal precedent to now come after adult health care for trans folks. And I think that lots of people are feeling that fear right now. The flip side of that, so the Supreme Court didn't say anything about healthcare for adults. They didn't extrapolate this decision outward to anything else. Like I said, even in their ruling, they said it was very narrow. It didn't apply to some of these other cases. And I want to be really clear here that there's lots of trans litigation happening right now. In January, when Trump took office, there was a slew of executive orders. And there's been litigation on every one of those executive orders that attacks trans folks, right? This ruling doesn't affect any of that litigation. Those court cases are still going on. It doesn't affect any of the litigation we have going in Idaho here. So it does apply pretty narrowly to gender affirming care for youth. It does apply pretty narrowly to the states that have banned this care. So what the court was really deciding is it constitutional for states to ban this care? And so what we see now is really similar to the Dobbs decision, where abortion is legal in some states and not in other states. We really have that same type of patchwork across the U.S. for gender affirming care for youth.
Need a reset or just a chance to slow down? Trade the traffic and to-do lists for a glass of wine and an open sky at Walla Walla. Just a scenic 4-hour drive from Boise, this peaceful destination in the heart of the Pacific Northwest offers a true escape from your hectic schedule. You'll have the opportunity to wander through more than 130 wineries nestled among golden hills and vineyards, and then cozy up in a tasting room. You can stroll through the charming historic downtown by day, and at night, dine al fresco on meals made by celebrated chefs from fresh ingredients grown just down the road on local farms. Come discover why Walla Walla is one of the Pacific Northwest's best-kept secrets. You don't have to go far to feel far away. Plan your getaway at wallawalla.org today.
Your gut affects everything, even your mood. So Ollie created 2 brand new products to take care of your insides. Ollie Big 10 Probiotic has 10 strains of probiotics, their most ever, to support a healthy gut microbiome, immune system, and stress response. And Ollie Super Good Superfoods delivers 15 superfoods in tasty gummy form. Find them at ollie.com and exclusively at Walmart.
Ollie!
These statements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease.
So, Jenna, let's say I'm a parent of a trans teen in Idaho. What are my options now for getting my child gender-affirming healthcare?
Yeah, and to speak to that first, I want to say that this Supreme Court decision and the law that is now fully effective in Idaho deal solely with 3 things. So they deal with puberty blockers, they deal with hormones, and they deal with surgery. And so those things are banned in Idaho. However, we know that that is not all that encompasses gender-affirming care. And so I want to be really clear that counseling, other mental health services, things like a social transition where you wear different clothes, cut your hair, start going by a different name, those things are all still legal and accessible here in Idaho. And I make that distinction because I think sometimes with decisions like this, again, it's really easy to feel hopeless and that we don't have any tools here in Idaho to support trans or non-binary kids. But there still are lots of tools. And this Supreme Court decision and our law really only bans a few of those things, right? That being said, care is still available in other states as well. And so what we've seen from our trans community is that, unfortunately, many of them have moved out. Many of the families that have trans youth have moved out of state in order to have more access to that care.
Let's say a family is staying here for care. I know there's been a lot of news lately about, can people access your medical records? Can law enforcement access medical records? What protections are in place? What are the legal risks? So let's say you want to continue to live in Idaho, but access gender affirming care for your trans teen. Are there legal risks for, let's say, you want to fly to Seattle for the weekend and get some hormones or puberty blockers? Are there legal risks to that? Are there protections in place for those medical records? What's going on there?
I think to answer this question best, first off, I have to go back to the fact that this care is only now banned in states that have passed laws banning it. Idaho is one of those states. States like Washington, Oregon, even California, Colorado, they don't have laws banning this care. So it is still accessible here to go get that care in a different state. I think, I think it was 2023, we saw a law that used the words like human trafficking, or it was a trafficking law that applied to abortion. So if you took a minor across the border, you could be charged with trafficking for an abortion. We don't have a law like that here in Idaho, and it is something that we will fight if it comes. But right now, you still have a right to go access care in other states. And I love your question around privacy, because that is really an important consideration here. Washington and I think Oregon too have shield laws. So they do have shield protections for some of this stuff. But I do think the privacy aspect could be strengthened. But like I said, right now, you just still have some options.
Jenna, what would you say to someone who, when you're bringing up the Skrmetti decision or this ban, says, well, I think these bans are about protecting kids. It's not really targeting trans people or trans teens. How would you respond to that?
So I think a common phrase that you hear from people who might say this is that trans kids don't exist, right? And I think not acknowledging that trans kids do exist, and they are living in a rough world, in a rough state where their government is really attacking them and is passing lots of laws every year to try to narrow the rights of trans people. And I think not acknowledging that is really harmful. And I think also that this issue has been so politicized, and that's where that rhetoric of these bans protect children really comes from. I think if folks were really interested in protecting children, they would want to protect trans children too. And so that argument or that phrasing really falls flat for me, I think. Because what you're saying is that we can protect some children, but not others. And to bring this back to what we were talking about at the beginning of this conversation, that these treatments are safe. They are approved by almost every major medical institute. I would say, most doctors agree that this type of care should be accessible to people, to families, really. And so to say that these types of bans or these types of laws are protecting children, I would kind of ask, whose children are you protecting? Because for parents of trans youth, for parents of a 14-year-old, a 15-year-old, a 16-year-old residing in Idaho, I don't think that these bans are protecting them. And I think that if your interest was truly in protecting kids, you wouldn't ban this care outright.
Yeah, when I worked as a nurse, that experience definitely, I have a hard time taking people seriously when they, especially politicians, when they rail against puberty blockers or hormones, because I would administer puberty blockers to all kinds of kids for all kinds of reasons. And the doctor would suggest it to a parent. The parent would say, can I get more information? They'd talk about it, decide on a treatment plan, and go forward. We administer the puberty blockers. Nobody cares. Whole different conversation when now suddenly we have to, or we talk about administering it for a trans child or for gender dysphoria, that suddenly now we've got to talk to lawyers. Now it's suddenly a big deal. And so, yeah, whenever I hear the legislators talk about, oh, puberty blockers are the worst, they're destroying kids, I'm like, there are hundreds of children in this valley currently on puberty blockers, and they don't care at all. They never talk about that. So I have a really hard time taking them seriously for the 20 trans kids who are on puberty blockers in this valley. It becomes so apparent they don't know what they're talking about.
Yeah. And I think that, that brings up a really good question of, I've been at the ACLU for 2.5 years. One of the first things that I was involved in when I came to the ACLU was HB 71 in 2023, which is our gender affirming care ban for youth. And, the messaging that came through in the hearings was that these drugs are unsafe. They make kids sterile. They have tons of side effects. They're not FDA approved, et cetera, et cetera. And that's just not true. And what you were just saying, why is it safe for some kids in Idaho to have these medications, but not others? And so you that type of logic, it really falls flat for me. It doesn't really make a lot of sense for me.
Jenna, could I have you really briefly list or discuss what resources or rights or legal protections trans people in Idaho still have right now? Like you mentioned about misinformation, I don't want this conversation to get extrapolated to trans adults or create fear where there still are rights, there still are resources. Could you list just a few maybe major things or major categories of rights and resources that trans people still do have in Idaho?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to kind of go back to what I said earlier. So specifically for youth, you still have access to other types of gender affirming care. So HB 71 and the Scrimeti decision affect puberty blockers, hormones, and surgery, but you still have an option to see a counselor. And we know with trans youth, having an affirming counselor, having affirming adults in your life makes such a huge difference. It brings down the suicide risk. It allows them a safe place to still exist, and allows them a trusted person to still talk to, right? So that is still accessible here. You still have a right here, whether you're an adult or a child, to express yourself authentically. And in Idaho, we have several, and I should say actually more than several anti-trans laws on the books. But particularly if you're a student and you have parental permission to go by a different name and different pronouns in school, you still have that right here. That parental permission here is key because that is a law that was changed a couple years ago. But there is still access to care. Now moving to adults, there is still access to care, gender affirming care, whether that's hormones, surgery, counseling, that remains legal here for adults. We do, there are some laws that affect Medicaid coverage of that, and there are some lawsuits still going through the courts on that. So we should expect to see some more legal decisions on that. But other than that, there are lots of mental health resources. There are lots of community resources here. When I started at the ACLU, a couple years ago, what I saw was that people were really starting to respond to the moment, to the attacks on trans folks. There were new organizations popping up. There were new chapters of PFLAG, for example, popping up for parents to learn how to support their kids. There were, new organizations like TransJoy Boise, who I know has been on CityCast Boise, popping up to support the community. the Idaho Queer Caucus, which, is a little bit newer, but they kind of came out in response to some of these laws and these attacks on queer and trans people. And so I would say that they're, our biggest resource as LGBTQ people, as queer people in Idaho, I think really is each other, and knowing that you're not alone. And knowing that you have a community around you. I attended Story Night last night, where Nixon Matthews told some of his story about being a trans person in Idaho. And he got a standing ovation, which I'm told is very, very rare at Story Night. So there are people in your community that love you, that want you here, and that will stand up for you with these past 5 years of attacks.
Jenna, thank you so much. I know you've been working around the clock since the Scarametti decision, so I really appreciate you taking the time to break it down and explain how it will affect Idahoans.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Lindsay. I think this is an important issue. It's one that has been, heavily politicized by the media. And so I think it's really important that we talk about this, that we counter that narrative. And so thank you for having me.
That's all for today here on CityCast Boise. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure and tell your friends about the show. We'll be back tomorrow morning with an inside look at Idaho's swinger community. You won't want to miss it.